In this video, we will talk about how to best fit your UI in Unity. The most important aspects of UI in Unity are screen size, canvas settings, and anchors. We will create a simple main menu. This menu will consist of UI elements like text, images, and buttons. We will fit the UI on a canvas object. And most importantly, anchor your UI elements so they fit in most screen sizes or dimensions. We'll start from scratch so you can build along with me. Let's get started. I'll create a new scene, and we'll call this main menu. Let's load that scene, and we're going to create our first object. This is going to be our canvas object. If you haven't already, first and foremost, it's important to consider the ideal screen size for your game. When dealing with UI, the sizing and spacing of your elements hinges on your canvas settings, and the most important canvas element is most common canvas setting is screen space overlay. I'll show you here. So if we click on canvas, the canvas setting here is screen space overlay, and that means that anything that the camera is viewing is going to throw the elements of the canvas on top of that. This is most common for most video games, unless you are having a 3D game where you have elements on a screen and you want to make that UI show up on the screen. And once you set it to screen space overlay, that means that the canvas size and dimensions will be dependent on your screen size. If we look at our game view, I have my screen dimensions set to 1280 by 800. This is a weird size. I'm going to change it to 1920 by 1080. And you'll notice that this overlay of my canvas object is going to change shape. You can see that it got bigger. If I change it to something else, like 1280 by 720, this one scales to that particular size. Another way to view this is by aspect ratio. And if I change it to 16 by 9, this changes again. But you'll notice that if I resize my game window, this might scale to get larger or bigger appropriately. You can see that this is the main dimension here. As I make my game view bigger, the canvas also stretches out to fit that space. So the whole goal of this is if we have this set to screen space overlay, we want to be able to change the dimensions because maybe you have set your game to have multiple dimensions so a player can fit it into their screen. And your UI elements may sit in weird spots if you don't set this up correctly. So let's go ahead and pick a dimension. I'm going to go 1920 by 1080. If your game is already set to something else, then use that setting. We're going to put some elements, like we said, an image, a couple images, some text, and some buttons. These are the most common elements in a main menu. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to create. And I like to set my stuff on, we already have the canvas, but I'm going to put it on a panel. And this allows me to give just a little bit of color if you don't already have an image set as your background. And you'll notice that this color has a bit of alpha layer to it. I'm just going to change that alpha layer all the way to non-transparent at all. From there, I want to set the rest of my UI elements onto this panel. You can change the size of this panel if you want to, but be aware that as we adjust our anchors, everything is going to be nested depending on their parent. So this panel is a child of the canvas. All future objects we're going to set as childs of this panel. I'm going to add an image, and we can see this here. And I'm going to drag in my Skelly character into this image. I'm going to go to my project window and drag in the sprite into the source image area. And you'll notice that Skelly shows up there. And it's bound by the rect transform here. I'm going to set it so that I preserve the aspect so that if I make this rect transform bigger, I don't get a stretched out version. I'll undo my preserve aspect and you'll notice that the image will stretch out according to that rect transform. Turn that back on and I'll move my Skelly over here like this. I have one image. I'm going to pull this into my panel so that if I resize my panel, this element moves along with it. I haven't adjusted the anchors yet. We're going to do this in a moment. We're going to add a couple more elements. UI, we're going to add a text mesh pro text object, and we're going to set this over here onto the right side. What's nice about text mesh pro is that different than the regular text UI object, we can change our font size or scale it to the rect transform. So if I resize this text size, the rect transform for the text object, the text isn't getting bigger because I don't have this auto size checked. But if I check it, then I get the options of the auto size min and max. And so the minimum, according to the size of this box, will be 18 and the max will be 72. And you'll notice that right now it's at the maximum of 72. So if I know my text is going to get bigger in my UI, I should change my max value to something bigger and it will scale appropriately. Let's make this something like 150. And that might be a good size in this case. And you'll notice that if I resize my text rect transform, it'll scale itself to the bounds of this rect transform. And then considering the min, I'll make it smaller and smaller and smaller, and it will stop at the point of it being size 18. I can change that there, and right now, according to the size of the box, it's stopping at 18. And so depending on your dimensions and screen size, you might want to adjust that. And this is nice if you have a game that you're allowing more than one dimension, because then your text will show up in its appropriate size. I'm going to adjust some more settings so that the alignment is in the middle of the box and center, or middle. Great, so I have some text, and maybe this will be my title text. This will be Skelly's Adventure. Just adjust this a little bit more. I'm not changing the anchor points yet. I want to lay everything out first and then change the anchors. Make sure that my text element is in the panel. I'm going to have one more thing. We're going to do UI button. And there's two options. We have the traditional button here, and then we can use the Text Mesh Pro button. And if you choose this one, then you also get the Text Mesh Pro for your text of the button, which again allows you to use the auto size feature. So if this button grows, then you want that text to also scale. By default, it's not set. So as you see, when I'm stretching the size of my button, the text is not resizing. Let's just place the button over here, something like this, and put it somewhere like that. Then I'll go into the child object of the text. It looks just like the other Text Mesh Pro object that we have, but it's nested in this button. And I'll turn on the auto size, change so that the max and min is something like 90 to 18. That's nice. And I'll rescale the inner text box to fit in the center of my button object. Remember, these are two objects nested one into the other, and I want to be in the center of it in my case. Great. So now we have text, we have a button, we have our image. Before we adjust our anchors, I want to demonstrate why it's important to appropriately set our anchors. If we go to a different dimension, let's say 1280 by 720, you'll notice that, oh, this stuff is not moving appropriately in the way that we expect. What we should do then is go back to our ideal dimensions and start adjusting some things. And remember, we want to put all of our elements into the panel. Maybe you want to, maybe you don't. I'm setting everything like that so that if the panel happens to resize too, then my other elements resize as well, because these are nested objects. So now that we have everything nested the way that we want to remember that UI elements are going to resize themselves according to their nested pattern. So if my button gets bigger, my text size should get bigger too. If my panel gets bigger, then my button should get bigger and my text should get bigger. Great. So for my text of my button, I want to anchor it to the size of my button. So if my button gets bigger, then the text should get bigger as well. And you'll notice that these little triangle-y widgets here represent the anchors of the text that I have. You can set them to the corners of your rect transform of your button. And so if this button gets bigger, the text should get bigger as well. We can demonstrate that here. I'm going to select the button and make the button get bigger. We should see the text scale as well. I'm demonstrating this as simulating the screen size getting bigger. But this is ideally what should happen if we happen to pick a bigger dimension. We'll have a demonstration of that in a second. So let's just resize this thing. We can see that the text is scaling according to the button. And now we need to go to our button and set its anchors. The button is automatically by default set here. And what I normally do so that it scales to most sizes is I set the anchors to the corners of my rect transform. I find that this 9 times out of 10 does me well in when I resize everything. There's different strategies, but this I feel like is the most common. Oh, I need to rotate my text object, button object. And I'm going to do this for my text here. I'm just going to rename this so that this is my title text. And again, my anchors are over here. I want to drag each little triangle widget so that they sit at the corners of my rect transform of my text object. Great. Let's move over to Skelly and select Skelly. It's my image here, and I'm gonna just type in Skelly so that I remember which image it's representing. And I'm going to drag my widgets to the corners again. I don't want to do it over here where I see my image. I want to have it on the rect transform corners. Great, so that's pretty close. I think we've changed all the rect transforms. The panel is on the corners, of course, of the canvas. So that means that the panel will resize according to the size of the canvas. If we go over here now and change our dimensions from 1920 to 1080 to 1280 by 720, we should see that everything is in relative position. And that's great. Whereas before, things were off screen and in a weird spot. Let's go to a different one. Let's go to 1280 by 800. So it's slightly different. Again, everything is set to the same spot. The text stay the same size, and you can notice that they turn into sort of hamburger style. We could adjust it so that the text stays horizontal, and we could do that by going back to our ideal size and making our box just slightly more slim. So I'll just make it more squat like that, adjust my widgets so that if we were to make the screen size a little bit fatter or taller, this doesn't turn into 2 layers. Go back into the other one. There we go. We still remain horizontal. We can add other things just to drive this idea home. I have a frame that I put on here. And maybe I want to put this frame, oops, I want to make sure that I add it as a UI image and UI image. Double click on this guy, move it over so that it's going to be on top of my Skelly. And I'll drag in the frame into the source image. Double click here and resize the rect transform. Again, I have this set so that if I make this thing longer than tall, then it deforms itself a little. And if I don't want that, then I want to make sure that I click on preserve aspect. And this keeps the natural imported aspect ratio of the image. Now that I have this centered around my Skelly, I'm going to adjust the anchors again at the corners of my rect transform. Great. And if I resize to something different, we have the set. Oh, so this is where centering or changing the pivot point of your image is going to make a big difference. Ideally, we don't have a game that goes from portrait and landscape, but setting the pivot point to the center of your object is going to get you the best mileage. Great. In the next video, we'll talk about how to set up simple scripting so we can load different scenes from the UI. Ideally, this would be something like, if we go here, we'll change this text to start game. And we'll talk about scene management and how to get everything loaded. Please like and subscribe. I'm going to link the art assets that we used in this video. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.